History often remembers the conquerors who rode horses into golden cities, but it rarely remembers the naked man who walked out of the wilderness. In the year 1527, a fleet of 5 ships set sail from the Spanish port of Sanlúcar de Barrameda. Their goal was to conquer the unknown lands of Florida. Their reality became one of the most harrowing survival stories in human history. The man at the center of this storm was not a soldier, but a treasurer. His name was Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. He did not know it then, but he was destined to lose his title, his clothes, and his country. He would gain something far stranger. The expedition was led by Pánfilo de Narváez. He was a man known for his brute force and his jealousy of the famous Hernán Cortés. Narváez wanted his own empire. He wanted gold. The King of Spain gave him permission to claim the lands from the Rio de las Palmas all the way to Florida. Cabeza de Vaca was appointed as the royal treasurer. His job was to ensure the crown received its share of the treasure. It was a job for a bureaucrat, not an explorer. This appointment placed 2 very different men in charge of one very dangerous journey. The tension between them would seal the fate of hundreds. The journey across the Atlantic Ocean was cursed from the start. A hurricane struck the fleet near the island of Cuba. 2 ships were lost. Over 60 men drowned. Narváez stopped in Cuba to resupply. He bought another ship. He recruited more men. He was determined to prove his strength. He ignored the warnings of the local sailors. He ignored the signs of the seasons. It was a fatal display of arrogance. They set sail again in the spring of 1528. The fleet anchored near the shores of Florida. In a bay they named La Cruz. The conquistadores had arrived. Narváez made a decision that baffles historians to this day. He decided to split his forces. He ordered his ships to sail along the coast to find a harbor. He ordered his land forces, about 300 men, to march inland on foot. Cabeza de Vaca argued against this. He warned that separating the army from its supplies was a death sentence. Narváez did not listen. He wanted to claim the interior for himself. He saw the land as a prize to be seized. He did not see it as a trap. The 2 groups never saw each other again. The men on foot were now alone in a vast, unknown continent. The march inland was a march into hell. The terrain was difficult. The heat was unbearable. The men carried heavy armor. They carried swords and crossbows. They expected to find the Aztec gold that Cortés had found in Mexico. Instead, they found swamps. They found mosquitoes. They found a people who did not want them there. The indigenous tribes of Florida, the Timucua and the Apalachee, were skilled warriors. They used guerrilla tactics. They fired arrows from the brush. They harassed the Spaniards day and night. The heavy armor that protected the soldiers became a torture device in the humid swamps. The Spaniards reached the village of Apalachee. They expected a city of gold. They found a small settlement of 40 huts. There was no gold. There was no food. The natives had fled. The soldiers raided the village for corn. They found only enough to feed the army for a few days. The morale of the men crumbled. They realized their leader had led them into a wasteland. They were starving. They were sick. They were far from their ships. They decided to turn back towards the coast. It was a retreat that would cost them everything. They returned to the sea, but the ships were gone. They had no way to escape. They were stranded on a coast they did not know. They had no food and no shelter. They had to build their own way out. They decided to build boats. This was a task that seemed impossible. They were not shipbuilders. They had no tools. They had no nails. They had no sails. Yet they had to try. They melted down their stirrups and spurs to make nails. They wove palm fronds to make sails. They used their shirts and trousers for caulking. They worked like demons. They were starving. They ate their horses. They ate roots. They ate anything they could find. In September of 1528, The makeshift fleet was ready. 5 fragile boats pushed off into the Gulf of Mexico. They looked more like floating coffins than ships. Over 200 men squeezed into these vessels. They hugged the coastline, trying to sail west towards the Spanish settlement in Mexico. They did not know the distance. They did not know the currents. The boats leaked constantly. The men bailed water day and night. Their skin rotted from the salt water. Their thirst was a constant torment. They drank rainwater when it fell. They drank urine when it did not. The journey by sea was a slow destruction. The autumn storms began to churn the Gulf. One by one, the boats drifted apart. Narvaez was on a different boat. He drifted out to sea, never to be seen again. His ambition had consumed him. Cabeza de Vaca was on a boat with the governor of the expedition. The current pushed them relentlessly westward. They passed the mouth of the Mississippi River, a beast of muddy water they did not recognize. They drifted past the shores of Texas. The men were dying. They were too weak to move. They lay in the bottom of the boats, waiting for death. On a cold November day in 1528, Cabeza de Vaca's boat washed ashore on an island. It was a place the natives called Malhado. It means Isle of Misfortune. The name was perfect. The boat ran aground on a sandbar. The men were too weak to pull it to shore. They lay in the freezing surf. That night, a wave picked up the boat and smashed it. The survivors were scattered on the beach. They were naked. They were freezing. They were alive, but barely. The natives of the island found them. These were the Capoques and the Hans. The Spaniards expected to be killed. They were conquerors, after all. But the natives did not kill them. They sat with them. They cried for them. They built fires to warm them. They gave them food. It was a moment of profound confusion for the Spaniards. They had come to enslave these people. Now these people were saving their lives. The roles had reversed. The masters had become the beggars. The winter of 1528 was the darkest hour. The men began to die of dysentery and starvation. The cold was bitter. The Spaniards had no clothes. They had lost everything. They were buried in the sand for warmth. They looked like corpses. Only a handful of the original crew survived. Among them were Andrés Dorantes, Alonso del Castillo, and a Moorish slave named Estebanico. These 4 men would eventually form a bond that would change history. But in that first winter, they were just desperate men trying to see the next sunrise. A horrific event occurred that sealed the fate of the survivors. The Spaniards were too weak to work. The natives fed them. They asked the Spaniards to cure their sick. The Spaniards knew nothing of medicine. They were soldiers. But they feared refusal would anger the natives. So they pretended. They made the sign of the cross. They prayed over the sick. To their shock, the natives claimed they were healed. The natives began to revere them. They called them medicine men. This was the first spark of a transformation. Cabeza de Vaca was no longer a treasurer. He was becoming something else. However, the situation remained desperate. The natives realized the Spaniards were consuming too many resources. They separated the survivors. They enslaved them. Cabeza de Vaca was sent to live with a different group. He was forced to become a servant. He had to gather roots. He had to gather wood. He was beaten. He was starved. He spent years in this bondage. He learned the language of the people. He learned their customs. He learned how to survive in a world where he had no power. During this time, a dark rumor spread among the tribes. Some said the Spaniards were dangerous. Some said they brought bad luck. Then, a strange thing happened. 5 Christians who had been held on the mainland went mad. They left their captors and fled. They became cannibals. They ate each other. This horror spread through the native communities like wildfire. The natives were terrified. They looked at the remaining Spaniards with fear. They thought they were all capable of this evil. This event destroyed the remaining trust between the two peoples. Cabeza de Vaca was caught in the middle of this chaos. He had to prove he was not a monster. He had to show he was useful. He worked harder. He learned to communicate. He spent hours listening to the stories of the elders. He began to understand the complex web of tribes in the region. He saw the violence between tribes. He saw the slavery. He saw the suffering. He was no longer an outsider looking in. He was a participant. He was a slave among slaves. The conquistador was dead. The wanderer was born. This period of captivity lasted for several years. It was a time of stripping away the old identity. Cabeza de Vaca forgot the comforts of Spain. He forgot the greed for gold. He focused on the root in his hand. He focused on the fire in the evening. He focused on staying alive. He developed a deep respect for the people who held him captive. He saw their humanity. He saw their kindness, even when they were cruel. He understood that survival required adaptation. He had to become one of them to survive. He had to walk the path of the medicine man. By the year 1530, the landscape of the expedition had changed completely. The Grand Armada was gone. The golden dreams were ashes. Narvaez was dead. The might of the Spanish Empire had been reduced to a handful of broken men scattered across the Texas coast. Cabeza de Vaca was alone. He was separated from his fellow countrymen. He was a naked servant in a foreign land. He had walked into the new world as a master. He now lived in it as a servant. The first phase of his journey was complete. The empire had fallen. The man remained. The isolation was not total. He maintained a faint connection with the other three survivors, Dorantes, Castillo, and Estevanico. They were enslaved by different tribes nearby. They could not speak freely, they could not plan, but they knew the others were alive. This knowledge was a thin thread of hope. It was a reminder of who they once were. But the years dragged on. The hope began to fade. The reality of their new life set in. They were not exploring, they were existing. They were trapped in a cycle of labor and hunger. Cabeza de Vaca's time with the Charuco tribe taught him the essential skills of the wild. He learned to use a fire drill. He learned to identify edible plants. He learned to hunt with a bow. He was clumsy at first. He failed often, but he persisted. He had no choice. Failure meant death. He became an expert in the geography of the region. He knew where the fresh water was hidden. He knew where the prickly pears grew. This knowledge was his currency. It was his way out. He eventually saw an opportunity to change his station. He proposed a deal to his captors. He would trade for them. He would go into the interior and exchange goods. The tribes valued shells, flint, and ochre. Cabeza de Vaca offered to be the courier. The natives agreed. This was the turning point. He was allowed to move freely. He was no longer tied to a single camp. He could walk. He could explore. He could look for a way home. He was still a slave, but he was a slave with a purpose. He began to walk. He walked immense distances. He traveled deep into the interior of Texas. He saw things no European had ever seen. He encountered the Caddo people. He saw the vast herds of bison. He described them as cows with small horns. He saw the huge, open plains. He was mapping the unknown in his mind. He was gathering intelligence, but he was also gathering a new perspective. He traded with the natives. He acted as a middleman. He began to practice the art of negotiation. This was the skill of a diplomat, not a soldier. As he traveled, his reputation began to grow. The natives saw that he was different from the others. He was not violent. He was helpful. He brought them things they needed. He listened to their problems. He began to heal the sick again. He blew on them. He made the sign of the cross. He recited the Lord's Prayer. He did not know if it worked, but the natives believed it worked. They called him a child of the sun. They thought he held the power of life and death. He did not correct them. He let the legend grow. It was his shield. It was his sword. By 1534, the timeline of the shipwreck had faded into memory. The survivors had lived as slaves for nearly 6 years. But destiny had not finished with Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. He had gained his freedom through cleverness. He had convinced his captors to let him trade. Now he used that freedom to plan an escape. He was not alone in his desire to go home. He found 3 other survivors who were ready to risk everything. These men were Andrés Dorantes, Alonso del Castillo, and Estebanico. Estebanico was an enslaved man from Morocco. He spoke Arabic. He had adapted to the new world faster than anyone. These 4 men met in a forest. They made a pact. They would walk south. They would walk west. They would walk until they found the Spanish Empire. Their plan was desperate. They had no maps. They had no weapons. They wore only loincloths. They were barefoot. They had to cross lands that no European had ever seen. They decided to present themselves as healers. This was their only protection. If the tribes thought they were medicine men, they would feed them. They would guide them. The 4 men began their journey. They left the safety of the Texas coast. They stepped into the vast, dry plains of the interior. The transformation of Cabeza de Vaca was now complete. He was no longer a Spanish treasurer. He was a shaman. His method of healing was strange. It was a mix of Catholic ritual and native practice. He would begin by making the sign of the cross over the sick person. He would recite the Lord's Prayer. He would blow on the patient. He believed his breath carried the power of healing. The natives believed it too. They brought him their sick. They brought him their dying. He treated wounds. He removed arrows. He blew on them. The people reported that pain vanished. They reported that fevers broke. Word spread fast across the land. The children of the sun were walking. The geography changed as they moved west. They encountered the vast herds of bison again. They saw the plains that would later be called Texas. The tribes here were different. They were the Jumano and the Cibola. They were hunters. They were mobile. They followed the herds. The 4 Spaniards had to keep up. They walked for days without rest. Their feet bled. They used the soft bark of trees to bandage their soles. They ate prickly pears. They ate nuts. They ate whatever the land provided. They were often hungry, but they were no longer slaves. They were guests of the earth. A phenomenon began to occur that puzzled the natives. As the 4 men traveled, their fame grew. Tribes from miles away came to see them. They brought gifts. They brought food. They brought flint and hides. They wanted the medicine men to bless their villages. The Spaniards realized they had a unique power. They could command the loyalty of thousands without a sword. They became traders of souls. They walked in peace. They were accompanied by an escort of natives. The escort changed as they moved from territory to territory, but the protection never wavered. It was a traveling city of wanderers. They reached the mountains. The terrain became rugged. The air grew cold. They crossed the Rio Grande. They entered the lands of the Pueblo people. These were farmers. They lived in houses made of adobe. They grew corn and beans. They were settled. They were wealthy compared to the coastal tribes. Here, Cabeza de Vaca saw the first signs of civilization since Florida. He saw cotton blankets. He saw turquoise jewelry. He saw permanent villages. He realized that the interior of the continent was not empty. It was full of life. It was full of culture. The Pueblo people told them stories. They spoke of other white men. They spoke of men with beards who came from the south. They spoke of strange beasts. The 4 survivors knew what this meant. These were Spaniards. They were close. The excitement was overwhelming. They pushed forward. They moved into the region that is now the Mexican state of Sonora. They saw the Sinaloa River. The water was a sign. It flowed towards the sea. It flowed towards Spanish territory. But the journey took a toll. The land was harsh. The mountains were steep. They faced a tribe called the Great Lords. These natives were hostile. They refused to trade. They refused to guide them. The 4 travelers were stuck. They had to negotiate. Estevanico stepped forward. He used his skill with language. He used his charisma. He convinced the tribe to let them pass. This moment showed the unique dynamic of the group. Estevanico was the guide. Dorantes and Castillo were the diplomats. Cabeza de Vaca was the spiritual leader. They were a team. They needed each other to survive. In the spring of 1536, they found the ultimate sign of their destination. They saw a piece of iron. They saw a buckle. They saw a broken horseshoe. These were not native items. They were Spanish. They frantically asked the locals where these items came from. The locals pointed south. They said, "Bad men." They said the men with iron came and took their people. They took their food. The four survivors understood. They were approaching the frontier of New Spain. They were approaching the edge of the civilized world. They pushed on. Finally, they saw a group of horsemen. They were Spanish soldiers. They were dressed in armor. They carried swords. They looked like gods from the past. The four naked men ran towards them. They shouted. They cried. They called out in Spanish. The soldiers stopped. They could not believe their eyes. They saw four savages. They saw sunburned skin. They saw matted hair. But they heard Spanish words. The commander of the cavalry unit was a man named Diego de Alcaraz. He stared at the wanderers. He asked who they were. Cabeza de Vaca stepped forward. He identified himself. He was the royal treasurer of the Narvaez expedition. He had been lost for 8 years. He had walked from Florida. The soldiers were stunned. They offered him clothes. They offered him food. The reunion was joyous. But it was also tense. The soldiers were on a slave raid. They were hunting the very people who had guided Cabeza de Vaca. This created a crisis of conscience. Cabeza de Vaca had lived among the natives. He knew their names. He knew their kindness. He had healed their children. Now he saw his own countrymen chaining them. He saw the terror in the eyes of the indigenous escorts. They had traveled with him for months. They had protected him. Now they were being enslaved. Cabeza de Vaca tried to stop it. He argued with Alcaraz. He said these people were friends. He said they were subjects of the king. The slavers ignored him. They saw only profit. They saw only labor. This moment was the end of the journey. It was the end of the medicine man. Cabeza de Vaca had to put on Spanish clothes again. He had to pick up a sword. He had to return to being a European. The transition was painful. He felt more connected to the natives than to the soldiers. He saw the cruelty of his own empire. He had walked across a continent and found peace. He returned to his own people and found brutality. The four survivors traveled south to Mexico City. They arrived in the capital of New Spain in July 1536. The viceroy, Antonio de Mendoza, received them with great honor. They were celebrities. They were the walking dead. They told their stories. They spoke of the vast lands to the north. They spoke of the cities of gold. They spoke of the 7 cities of Cibola. These stories ignited a new wave of conquest. Estevanico was bought by the viceroy. He would later guide the expedition of Fray Marcos de Niza. He would die on that journey, killed by natives who did not trust his greed. Cabeza de Vaca returned to Spain in 1537. He had been gone for 10 years. He went to the court of King Charles V. He did not ask for gold. He asked for a new position. He wanted to return to the Americas. He wanted to govern the lands he had walked. He was appointed governor of Rio de la Plata. This was in South America. He went there hoping to rule with justice. He remembered his time as a slave. He remembered the kindness of the natives. He tried to treat the indigenous people fairly. This made him enemies. The Spanish colonists wanted slaves. They wanted land. They rebelled against him. In 1545, Cabeza de Vaca was arrested. He was accused of corruption. He was accused of being too soft on the natives. He was shipped back to Spain in chains. The irony was crushing. He had walked across America as a free man. He returned to his own country as a prisoner. He was eventually cleared of the charges, but his career was over. He lived out his final years in obscurity. He wrote his memoirs. He titled them La Relación. He wanted the world to know the truth. He wrote about the shipwreck. He wrote about the walk. He wrote about the healing. He did not write about conquest. He wrote about survival. He wrote about the humanity of the people he met. He described the land with precision. He was the first European to describe the opossum. He was the first to describe the bison. He was the first to describe the vast cultures of the Southwest. He provided the first detailed account of the interior of North America. The legacy of Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca is complex. He was a man of his time. He was a conquistador. But he was also something else. He was a survivor. He was a wanderer. He was a healer. He walked over 2,000 miles. He saw the continent from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean. He experienced the New World in a way no other European did. He walked naked. He slept on the ground. He ate roots. He healed the sick. He became a medicine man. His story challenges our view of history. It is not a story of victory. It is a story of adaptation. It shows that the New World was not a wilderness to be tamed. It was a home to millions. It was a place of complex societies. The Spaniard who walked across America learned this lesson. He learned it in the fires of the natives. He learned it in the silence of the plains. He carried that lesson home, but the world was not ready to listen.